Sweden, Norway, close. Salmon stuff. I mean, I understand the confusion, expecting salmon things out of Norway. And yeah, we can start with a little apology for not being an economist. So any mistakes in methods and things like that that'll be a result of my lack of economics background. But before getting started, I'd like to acknowledge the data presented in this study was collected by my colleague Lotte Vandenheuvel, who's on maternity leave and unable to present stuff here this year. But I hope some of you may have met her or seen her at the last conference in Australia. So, Lotte herself, and I'd like to take you on a journey about 14, 15 hours flight north to the south of Sweden, to the Mörrum River, which is one of the most readily accessible salmon and sea-run brown trout fisheries in Europe. It's only a couple of hours drive from Copenhagen, about halfway between the bigger centers, Stockholm, Hamburg. But also, as far as salmon rivers go, it's very accessible as far as being open to anyone to be able to buy a license, quite affordable, easy to access, and so quite a popular destination for people wanting to target large Baltic salmon. And sea trout on the left, Atlantic salmon on the right. And although it's in a relatively populated area, still quite lovely, natural, scenic place to go fishing, which the value of has been recognized for nearly 1,000 years, or at least documented in writing. And although it's been valued and recognized for such a long time, in more recent years, we've seen a decline in salmon stocks. This is the period leading up to when the study was conducted. And that precipitous decline in 2018 led to a massive decrease in the number of fishing days sold in this river, which from an economic standpoint means a lot fewer anglers coming here, a lot fewer people spending money, which means less available for infrastructure to maintain access, to reduce damage from anglers visiting, things like that, less money for art, but in the context of recreational fisheries management, also less money for conservation, monitoring, maintaining the status of the stock and things like that, which is something that we're quite interested in. And so this study, following two of Lotte's other projects looking at destination image and angler perception of stock trends, which particularly important given the decreasing trends, we were asked to determine how much are anglers actually spending in this fishery, given it's quite accessible, low license costs, things like that, as well as how are anglers viewing current regulations and conservation actions being undertaken by the fishery manager, and to determine if there are any relationships between these economic values. Are people spending more, having a different perspective on what conservation actions, regulations are in place? And so this data was collected in 2019, asking anglers about their activity during the season, how much they're fishing, what they think of the fishing, things like that, as well as what they're spending inside and outside of the area to see the distribution of economic activity, asking them about what they're spending on travel, licenses, accommodation, food, about as many things as possible that we could measure, as well as asking them how much they would be willing to pay increased costs before they would choose to leave the fishery, as well as how much they'd be willing to pay for increased stocks and increased big fish in the system, as well as how much they feel support for the regulations and management actions that are currently in place. And so, numbers-wise, we calculated angler expenses in two ways. It was kind of driven by what data we had access to. We had the number of individual fishing days sold, as well as the number of unique customers. So we could take the average spent by our anglers and then multiply it by the number of customers, or we could multiply and divide by the number of fishing days spent, which gives us a high and a low estimate of total expenses in the area. And per day, or per angler, we have 200 euros to 1,200 euros spent per year in the area. Significantly less outside the area, but that makes sense as far as being there if you're spending money on guides, accommodation, things like that. For combined total spending per day of 250 euros, or just over 1,500 euros per year. But when we add this all together, we have between almost 2 million euros and over 4 million euros being spent per year in this year, which considering we had half as many anglers visiting this river is quite a large amount of money for around 2,500 customers and fishing in only about 40 kilometers of river area. When we divide these spendings by the number of fish caught, and this is a bit of a false denominator issue, they're not catching particularly many fish or harvesting very many, we see quite a high amount of money being spent relative to the number of fish being taken out of the system, with almost, on our high estimate, 30,000 euros being spent per fish, which I don't know of any market where you're buying salmon and that's the kind of value you're talking about per fish or per kilo, which is partially driven by the fact that release rates are very high. It's not much being spent per fish harvested, but still something that we're wanting to take forward to talk about how many fish are being lost as bycatch elsewhere in the Baltic, things like that, to show how much is being spent here in a year when it's half as many people visiting the fishery as elsewhere, which leads me to what we could project from these values if they had the average number or the high number the year before of anglers visiting the area. And so you've got potentially almost a doubling of expenses, although this would have to be discounted based on maybe some people would choose not to fish here because there'd be more crowding with other people. Maybe they'd fish for less days. Maybe they'd fish for more days if there's more fish potentially to catch. And that these values are actually all in like 2019 values. So you'd have to add another 25% to this high value to get in current value accounting for inflation, which puts things up to around 10 million euros potentially as the spending associated with this relatively small fishery on one of the smaller salmon rivers in Sweden, smaller salmon rivers in Europe. Adding on top of that, how much people would be willing to pay before they would stop fishing. It's quite high, but this is stated willingness to pay. Maybe they wouldn't actually pay this much, but that adds potentially another million euros on top of what they're actively spending in the fishery. And then the other side of this question, what they'd be willing to spend to double the supply of their target species, whether that's sea run brown trout or salmon, or to double the number of particularly large individuals, indicates quite a high value placed on improving the status of these stocks and improving the quality of the fishery, which ties in directly to potentially their support for management and support for the conservation actions going on. Which brings me to the second half of what we're looking at, where asking them to rank how supportive they are of, at the top here, interestingly, they gave the most support to 3 regulations that are in place, including mandatory catch reporting, the release of certain fish, and the current minimum size limit, which were all viewed as quite good. The anglers who are still participating in the fishery, quite happy with these things. Then we had significantly lower support for the creation effort putting in spawning beds with gravel, which would help both salmon and sea trout as well as freshwater mussels, which interestingly would have no impact on your fishing experience. So odd that that would get a significantly lower score. And then much lower support for the preservation of fallen trees in the river, which provides habitat for the juvenile fish before they go out to the sea, but also makes it more difficult to fish certain stretches of the stream, certain pools and things like that. And as well, lower support for the ending of a stocking program, which would have been increasing numbers of fish in the river. In this case, this could be directly tied to the fact that there was a very poor return the year before, but also that this is lower responses, particularly from certain groups of anglers. The next part, because we didn't want to just leave these two things standing, was to look at relationships between how much is being spent and these different levels of support. So we threw this into a PCA, and here I've got a lot of other factors as well that we were looking at relationships in, but we'll just focus at the top two, the factors around how much they're spending and these different regulations and management options. And here we can see relatively limited differences in loading on the first factor, but big differences in what's explaining economic responses and what factors are explaining the support for regulations or support for conservation actions, showing quite a large disconnect between these two major components, which we often talk about in terms of justifying support for conservation investment in changing things like that, is that it's related to the money being spent. But here we can see the anglers themselves, how much they're spending has no impact on what they're thinking or feeling is important as far as what's needed to boost the situation in the fishery or maintain quality of fishing, things like that. And there's a lot more that could be dove into in these other relationships, and I'll just highlight a few key correlations. So looking into those bigger relationships in more detail, we can see expenses strongly correlated with centrality to life, which makes sense. You fish more, you're going to spend more. But more interestingly, in the context of what we're looking at, there's a higher willingness to pay with the perception of healthy stocks. If you think the fishing's better, you're going to be willing to spend more money. And that expenses and willingness to pay was also strongly related to satisfaction with catches. Again, it makes sense, but it supports that idea that we need to have more fish, healthier fish stocks to actually realize these values. And so to summarize, the combined total expenditures and willingness to pay in the year of the study, which is a low year for participation, is quite high, and a lot of money being spent per fish. And again, you can add 25% to each of these values. You're looking at well over 5 million euros being spent by just a few thousand people to harvest under 200 fish. And that anglers generally have quite good support for the current management, despite the decline leading up to when the study was conducted, but that higher spending and willingness to pay is associated with healthier fish stocks, and that taking action to improve the fishery should result in better economic returns. But also, and I hope given the context of a lot of the other talks that we've had here about human dimensions, things like that, that we're just asking them how much they're spending. The actual total value to them, the health benefits, the psychological benefits, the cultural value. Salmon, sea trout, they're very important culturally in Northern Europe, as they've been fishing for them for thousands of years. That these are things that need to be taken into account as well when going forward and communicating with managers that, economic value can increase, but that's not all the value, and there's a lot more to be associated with each fish caught. So thank you very much, and if we've got time for questions, that's